everybody, this is Meredith from the Witty Gritty Paper Co. And today we are going to be discussing my top 5 tips for beginner watercolorists. So this video was actually inspired by a lovely message I received from a subscriber about a month ago, and she had some great questions that she didn't feel she could find answers to, and I thought they would be perfect for this kind of video because there are some things that you don't really know, because as soon as everybody figures them out, nobody talks about them anymore. But if you don't know them, then they can be huge stumbling blocks. So we're addressing that kind of thing today. And even if you are intermediate or advanced watercolorist, I think that you will find something valuable here. So let's get right into it. So the first tip is about cleaning your brush. So the message that I got, she talked about having trouble cleaning her brush, how she would dip it into water and then wipe it off, and how she couldn't seem to get it clean that way. And she had seen lots of other artists go really fast when they were cleaning their brushes, and she wondered, how do you get it clean? What's the best way? So I actually have a trick for this that works very well for me. And I didn't find it out when I was first painting, and I ran into the exact same issue. Like I wasn't sure what to do with my brush. Did I like squeegee it on the side or wipe it off, or I didn't know. But then I figured out something that has saved me a lot of time. So first, let's get some paint on this brush to illustrate our point. So let's say that we're using some indigo. So a very concentrated color here. Go paint some out. So quite a dark color. So if I wanted to go right to yellow from indigo, I would need to have a very clean brush. Otherwise it would come out kind of green or at least muddy. So what I would do if I was using the indigo and I wanted to go switch to another color, I just wanted to clean my brush, put it right in my water. And here's the trick. You swirl in a figure 8, okay? And you can go very fast doing this. So don't just dunk it in. Don't squish it on the bottom. That's not good for your brushes. And don't like squeegee it on the side a ton. You can do it a little to get off that extra drop of water, but all you really need to do is swirl it in a figure 8. And once you get the hang of this, you can go quite fast. So if you look here, if I go and paint it out, there's no color on my brush, there's just water. So it cleans it quite quickly. The other thing to cleaning your brush, the other trick, is having at least 2 containers of water. So I only use 2. I use one for cleaning my brushes, this would be my rinse water, and then I use the other one for getting clean water when I'm mixing a color. So some artists use 3 or even 4 I've seen. It's really just personal preference. I've only found 2 necessary, but it's really up to you. If you like 3 or 4, then you do that. The other thing to keep in mind, the last thing to keep in mind about cleaning your brush is that if your water is too dirty, then you will not be able to get your brush clean. So if your rinse water itself has too much paint in it, you're not going to be able to get your brush completely clean. So if you're struggling to get your brush clean, that could be part of it. So look here, we'll take some yellow, put it right out on the paper. No green, just pure yellow, and I can clean it very quickly. Squeegee off that last bit of water, and we're back to just plain water. So that is what I have found to be the best way and the fastest way to clean your brushes. Okay, so let's move on to tip number 2 here. So this was also inspired by the message that I received, and I thought it was a great question. So she asked if she had a lighter color and she wanted to make some areas of a painting darker, but didn't have the darker version of the color, what would be the best way to do that? So if you only had light blue and you were painting an area light blue, but then you wanted some areas of it to be a darker blue, but you didn't have a darker blue, what could you do? So here is tip number 2, and it may seem like kind of a backwards answer to the problem, but my second tip for you is when you can, buy darker colors. Here's why. So I'll zoom in a little. I made a chart. We know charts are fun, so I made a chart. Let me move out of the way. Okay, so if you look at these 2 swatches at the top one is, I think it's anthraquinone. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, but anthraquinone blue by M. Graham. And as you can see, it's darkest over here on the left. And just by adding water, it gets quite a bit lighter across to the right. Now this is almost 1 shade, but if you count them, like 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 different shades of blue in just this one blue by adding water. Now, in contrast, this blue underneath it is Verditer blue, made by Daniel Smith. And as you can see, it's quite a bit of a lighter blue. And this is the darkest. This is like 1 shade, 2 shades, maybe 3 shades. Okay, so 3 shades compared to 5. And this was just one swatch test. So darker colors can always be made lighter. They're watercolors. You can always add water and make a ton of shades of one color from a dark color. But if you're starting with a light color, there are going to be less shades that you can make, and that's just the way it is. So when you have the option, if you only have the budget, or you only have the need for one color, and you don't know if you should get the lighter shade or the darker shade of it, I would recommend getting the darker shade, because you can always make the darker shade lighter, but you can't make the lighter shade darker unless you do one of the 3 methods that is below here. So it is easier, in my opinion, to just start with a darker color and make it lighter. But if you only have the lighter color, if you're already there and you need to figure out how to use it, then there are some things you can do. So the first thing you can do, we'll look at this circle right here. This is just a super concentrated mix of the Verditer blue. Okay, so we're talking about this lighter blue here. So this mix, I basically just added as little water as possible to make this. And as you can see, it does look quite a bit darker than the majority of the swatch up here. So that did make it darker by just adding as little water as I could. So that is one thing that you can do. And your paint will be a bit thicker. It's not going to go on as watery, but you can definitely do that. The second thing that you can do if you need to make your lighter color darker is you can add in another darker color that you have. So for this circle, I took the Verditer blue and I added just a little bit of sepia. And I believe it was the sepia made by Daniel Smith. But anyway, it definitely made it darker, as you can see, but it also changed the temperature of this color. It's a little bit of a cooler blue now. It almost looks like Antwerp blue. It doesn't look nearly as warm as the Verditer. Like, this almost looks a little ultramarine-y, but this looks definitely more like Prussian or Antwerp. But anyway, it changed the temperature is the point. So it did make it darker, but it's not exactly the same, just darker. It's a different temperature. It's a different sort of color, but you can do that. The last thing that you can do is you can take advantage of what watercolor is best at, and that is the fact that it is transparent. So for this circle over here, basically what I did was I made a pretty watery mix of the Verditer blue. We're still talking about this light blue up here. And I painted a circle. And I waited for that circle to completely dry. That's important. You can't rush this if you're going to do it this way. And then I took that same mix of paint when the circle was dry and I painted a stripe over it. So as you can see, it is darker where the 2 patches of paint overlap. So right in the middle here, we made a shade about twice as dark as the shade by itself. So this is the other thing that you can do if you have the lighter color and you want to make some areas darker, is you can glaze the watercolor, is what is the technical term. And you can get a darker color in the middle. So those are 3 ways that you can make a lighter color darker if you find yourself in need of that. Okay, on to tip number 3. Once again, was inspired by the message I received. I know, shocker. And she was wondering about palettes. So she mentioned seeing that a lot of artists would bring their palettes on camera and they'd already have paint dried in them. So she was wondering, like, you know, what's up with that? Do you store your paint there? You know, why is it in there when it comes on screen? So here's what I do. When I finish a painting, I always let my leftover colors dry in my palette completely. So that's tip number 3. Keep your palettes dirty. Here's why. I know this is going to sound kind of strange, but here's why. Watercolor, unlike basically every other medium, unlike acrylics, unlike oils, and even unlike gouache in most circumstances, is the only medium that will completely reactivate if left out to dry. So watercolor can completely dry, all the water can evaporate out of it, and it will reactivate very easily. So if I just take my brush here, this paint is totally dry. I'm touching it, you know, it's totally dry. If I just put my brush right in, it wakes right back up with almost no effort at all. So watercolors are the only paints that do this, that always do this. And the reason I leave my palette dirty is so that the next time that I go to paint a different painting, I come back, I find my palettes, and they're already full of color. So I'm usually going to use the colors left over in the painting that I'm doing now. So I phrased that badly, I apologize. The point is reusing the paint. So if you come back to your palette, there's already paint in it. Like at least half the time I can take the paint that's left over and I can use it in the colors I'm mixing for my new painting. And even if I can't use all the colors, I at least reuse some of them, and that is always good. Especially if you're using professional grade paint, you want to waste as little of it as possible. The other reason that I keep my palettes dirty is that you waste less water too. If you go to clean any palette out, not just this one, any palette out in the sink, and you clean it out with a faucet, you're going to use a lot more water to clean it out than you would if you just dunk your brush in your water and then reactivate it. Like that took one brushful of water. So you're gonna save a lot more water doing it that way, and then you can just wipe it off with a paper towel or a tea towel. So you save paint, you save water, and it also encourages you to mix more of your own colors instead of always taking your colors straight from the palette, you know, sort of uncut, so to speak. Mixing your own colors is a very important part of becoming a better artist, and in my opinion, this encourages it quite a bit. You'll even see some artists who keep their palettes, they like never clean out their palettes. They actually have sections in their palettes for different colors. Like they'll have one section that's just blues, one that's just greens, one that's just reds. You get the point, to reactivate whenever they need that color. So some artists really, they take it to an extreme. They never clean out their palettes. But it is, I think, an important thing to at least try out when you're a beginner. Okay, on to tip number 4. So as you may or may not know, because this is a pretty common fact, but it's not like, you know, you don't see it everywhere. There is a trick to working with pencils and watercolors. So I'm zooming in again here. So tip number 4 is do light pencil sketches if you're going to be working with watercolors. Here's why. So as you can see here, I've got 2 little faces. I've got this one on the left and I've got this one on the right. And the one on the right has some watercolor washed over it. So if I take an eraser, if I can find my eraser, okay, I found it. If you take an eraser and you go to erase this sketch, the one with the watercolor on it, she doesn't erase. Okay, my sketch is like exactly the same amount of visible as it was when I started, except for my eraser has some orange on it. So, moral of the story, as soon as you paint over any pencil sketch with watercolors, it won't erase. It basically locks it in. If you erase really hard with a lot of pressure, you might be able to take some of it up, but you're also going to be taking up the paint with it. And usually that kind of ruins the painting. Whereas if I just go to erase this face, you know, it comes off pretty easily. So the solution to this is basically doing your sketches and then erasing and making them a lot lighter. Like don't erase them completely, but make them a lot lighter. Or you can just sketch light to begin with. I always have an issue with that. I always have to erase to make it lighter, but as soon as you paint over it, it's basically permanent, and sometimes that can really throw a hitch into your painting if you didn't mean for the sketch to be visible at the end of the painting. So that's an important thing to know, is that it is going to show through to the same degree that you leave it the second you paint over it. Okay, on to our final tip. Now, this is going to seem very obvious to any veteran watercolor painter out there, but it is very, very important in my opinion and deserves its own tip. So tip number 5 is use actual watercolor paper. And what do I mean by actual watercolor paper? I mean paper that says watercolor on it. Paper specifically made for use with watercolors. So I will spin you a little tale of when I was a beginner watercolorist, and I kid you not, I used cardstock when I was first starting out, just like plain, I don't know, 65-pound cardstock, not even really heavy cardstock. And I'm here to tell you, that if you do that, your paint will pill and warp that paper very badly. And it is just not pretty. You really can't get any serious painting done if you're not using watercolor paper. What makes watercolor so special, you ask, watercolor paper? Well, basically, the paper is different because it's got something called sizing in it. All paper specifically made for watercolor has this. Basically, the sizing hangs out in the paper and makes it so that it can take a lot more water and abuse than your average paper without sizing, without warping, and without pilling. So I guarantee you that if you haven't used actual watercolor paper before and you switch to it, you will just notice a world of difference. You really can't become, I think, you really can't improve your talent if you don't have at least real watercolor paper. I think you can always have more wiggle room on brushes and paints, but the paper really, it's gonna fight you, is the bottom line. If you're not using real watercolor paper, it's gonna fight you. So in the US, it's pretty easy to find inexpensive, genuine watercolor paper. That was one of the things that scared me off most when I was a beginner, was the price of real watercolor paper. You know, it can get pretty frighteningly expensive sometimes, especially depending on where you buy it. Online, it's almost always a better price, but if you go to an art store, if you're fortunate enough to have an art store by you that sells it in the sheets or in the blocks, the more expensive brands can be quite expensive, like the all cotton ones, like Arches or Fabriano. You know, they can get quite expensive, and that can be, I think, quite intimidating to a beginner. But there are a lot of good, inexpensive watercolor papers out there these days, and I am a championer of them. I never think that you should use the expensive ones for practice or really anything if you're just starting out. So basically anything that Strathmore or Canson makes that is inexpensive and is watercolor paper is good. I've tried almost all of them made by those two because I actually really have, I have sort of an addiction to cheap watercolor paper. I just like love to try them every time I see them. So this, I left the price on for you guys to see. This is $13.11 I paid for this. So it's 30 sheets of watercolor paper, and it is 140-pound cold press. And watercolor comes in different finishes and different weights, but that's another video. But what I can tell you is that 140-pound cold press is usually the most common, and it's what I would recommend if you're starting out. But the point is, these sheets of paper, which are quite big, they're 11 by 15, so I definitely could cut them down in two, or even four. It was only $13.11 for the whole thing. So they aren't even 50 cents a piece, the sheets of paper. And they're gonna work worlds better than cardstock ever would for watercolor. So, and I'm not affiliated with Strathmore or Canson or anything, but I can tell you that using real watercolor paper is definitely going to make your life much, much easier. And I think you're going to improve a lot faster as a painter. Okay, so that's about it for today, everybody. I'm sorry that video got a little long-winded, but I want to thank my subscriber who sent me the lovely message as the inspiration for this. I love to hear from you guys, so that's great. If you like this, then I would love if you'd give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button if you want to see more of this kind of content. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye.